During a supposedly casual family dinner, the mood shifted when Marcella, my sister-in-law, casually announced, "So I lost my apartment. Guess I'll be crashing with you guys for a while." She flashed a smirk at my husband, Darius, as if they had already discussed this without me. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Excuse me?" Marcella shrugged nonchalantly. "Don't worry, I'm a great roomie. I'll just take the master bedroom since it's the biggest." My jaw dropped as Darius gave me an apologetic look. "Marcella, we didn't agree to that. You can't just invite yourself into our home." "Oh, come on, sis," she scoffed, her tone already grating. "Where else am I supposed to go? You wouldn't leave your favorite sister out on the streets, would you?" Before I could protest further, Marcella had already started hauling her belongings through the front door, dumping boxes and suitcases haphazardly in our living room. It was like a hostile takeover of my own home. Darius tried to play peacemaker. "Alara, maybe we can let her stay for a little while, just until she gets back on her feet." I shot him an incredulous glare. This was our house, our sanctuary. How could he agree to this unwanted invasion without consulting me first? Marcella caught my expression and laughed. "Relax. Teach. It's not like I'm a slob or anything. I'll clean up after myself." Her eyes danced with amusement as she added, "most of the time." That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that my peaceful life had just been upended. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a long, treacherous road ahead. True to her word, Marcella wasted no time making herself at home, a little too at home for my liking. Within days, her clothes and personal items were strewn about the house, as if she owned the place. Whenever I tried enforcing basic rules of courtesy, like cleaning up after herself, she'd blow me off with a dismissive, yeah, or an insincere, "Sure, Mom." Darius remained infuriatingly passive, which only emboldened Marcella's entitled behavior. "She's just going through a rough patch," he'd say. "Cut her some slack." One morning, I noticed several $20 bills missing from my wallet. When I confronted Marcella about it, she scoffed. "You're accusing me of stealing? Real classy, Alara." "Then where did the money go?" I pressed, my voice trembling with anger. "Maybe you just misplaced it," Darius chimed in, ever the mediator. "No need to make accusations." I shot him an incredulous look. Was he really taking her side? Marcella simply shrugged and sauntered off, leaving me fuming. Over the following weeks, I noticed more and more money disappearing from our joint accounts and my personal stash. Darius remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant. Whenever I brought up the missing funds, Marcella would expertly deflect and manipulate the conversation until I felt like the irrational one for even questioning her. "You're always nagging me about something," she snapped one day as I confronted her about another missing 20. "No wonder Darius is so stressed all the time." I opened my mouth to retort, but Darius cut me off. "Enough, you two. I'm sick of being caught in the middle of your constant bickering." Marcella shot me a smug grin, batting her eyes innocently. "Sorry, bro. I'll try to be more considerate of your wife's feelings." Her sickly sweet tone dripped with condescension, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. This was far from over. The real kicker came when Marcella decided to throw a party at our house, without asking permission, of course. I came home from work one evening to find a group of raucous strangers spilling out onto our front lawn, red Solo cups in hand. "What is going on here?" I demanded as soon as I spotted Marcella holding court amidst the chaos. She barely looked up from her conversation. "Oh, hey sis, just having a few friends over, no big deal." "No big deal? You can't just invite people into our home like this." Marcella rolled her eyes. "Relax, we're just having some fun. You could use to let loose for once." Before I could protest further, a guy I didn't recognize came stumbling out the front door, sloshing beer from his cup. "This party's lit," he slurred, giving me an inappropriate once-over. I recoiled in disgust. "That's it. This needs to end right now. Everyone out." Ignoring my outburst, Marcella shot me a wicked grin. "You know, if you kept acting so uptight, maybe Darius would have left you by now for someone more fun." White-hot fury coursed through me at her cruel insinuation. I opened my mouth to hurl back a blistering retort, but the sound of a loud crash from inside cut me off. My heart plummeted as I rushed through the door to find the cherished antique armchair, one of the few remaining pieces from my late mother's estate, overturned and shattered beyond repair. Tears stung my eyes as I fell to my knees, tenderly gathering the shattered remains. This had been one of Mom's most prized possessions, and these drunken idiots had destroyed it without a second thought. Marcella sauntered in, sizing up the wreckage with a casual shrug. Oh well, it was just an old chair anyway. No need to get so bent out of shape about it. I shot her a venomous glare, my grief quickly hardening into cold fury. Get out, I seethed through clenched teeth. Get your friends out of my house right now before I call the police. For once, Marcella seemed to recognize I wasn't making an empty threat. With a disdainful huff, she started ushering out her rowdy crew, muttering something about me being a stuck-up bitch under her breath. Darius rushed in once the commotion had died down, his eyes widening at the overturned furniture and shattered remnants of the armchair. Alara, what happened? Are you okay? I could only shake my head, my throat too choked with rage and sorrow to speak. This callous disregard for our home, our boundaries, our cherished belongings, it was unforgivable. Darius pulled me into an embrace, and that's when I realized with sinking dread he still didn't fully grasp the extent of his sister's cruelty. But I did, and I knew this was only the beginning. In the aftermath of Marcella's disastrous party, tensions in the house were higher than ever. I could barely look at her without feeling my blood boil. The smug, self-satisfied smirk she constantly wore only added fuel to the fire. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Marcella casually remarked, "You know, since I'm living here now, I should probably get my name added to the house deed." I froze, the plate in my hand clattering back into the sink. "Excuse me?" She shrugged nonchalantly. "Well, it only makes sense. I'm basically family, right? Might as well make it official." "Like hell you are!" I exploded, rounding on her. "This is our home, Darius and I. You're just a freeloader taking advantage of us." Marcella feigned an expression of wide-eyed innocence. "Darius, she's not seriously suggesting I'm a freeloader, is she? You know I'm good for it if you ever need help with the mortgage or anything." I whirled on my husband, desperate for him to take my side for once. But Darius merely averted his gaze, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "You can't be serious," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "Tell me you're not actually considering this." Before he could respond, Marcella piped up again with that simpering tone. "Of course he's considering it. Why wouldn't he want to do something nice for his beloved little sister?" "This is our house," I shouted, feeling like I was going insane. "Mine and Darius's. You have no claim to it whatsoever." "Hey, no need to get so worked up," Marcella said with an infuriating chuckle. "I'm just looking out for the best interests of this family." "You're not my family." The words exploded from me before I could stop them. An ugly sneer twisted Marcella's features. "Oh, I get it. I'm not the rich, precious family you always wanted, is that it? Just the embarrassing deadweight relative you can't wait to be rid of." "That's not what I meant at all," I protested weakly, but she was already on a roll. "Don't worry, I know where I'm not wanted. Maybe it's for the best if I strike out on my own after all." She shot me a look dripping with venom. "Just don't come crawling back when you lose everything you've taken for granted here." With that ominous warning hanging in the air, Marcella stormed off, leaving an unbearable silence in her wake. Darius finally spoke up, his voice weary. "Alara, maybe we should consider giving her what she wants, just this once, for the sake of keeping the peace." I stared at him, dumbfounded and utterly deflated. In that moment, I knew. He was never going to take my side over his sister's. The battle lines in this war had been drawn, and I was radio territory. After that explosive argument about Marcella trying to get added to the house deed, I felt completely alone and betrayed, even by my own husband. Darius remained frustratingly passive, always making excuses for his sister's outrageous behavior. In my despair, I ended up confiding everything to my best friend and next-door neighbor, Jonah. He listened patiently as I vented, tears of anger and hurt streaming down my face. "I just don't know what to do anymore," I said once I'd gotten it all off my chest. "She's made it clear she wants to take over our home, and Darius won't lift a finger to stop her." Jonah shook his head grimly. "Marcella's got him wrapped around her finger. Always has, from what you've told me. So I'm just supposed to let her walk all over me? Let her take everything I've worked for?" A determined look came over Jonah's face. Not a chance in hell. We're going to fight back and expose her for the parasite she truly is. His conviction emboldened me. What did you have in mind? Over the next few days, Jonah and I discreetly set up hidden cameras throughout the house to document Marcella's misdeeds. He also helped me track down financial records and receipts, showing how she'd been steadily siphoning money from our accounts. This is the evidence we need to show Darius her true colors, Jonah said as we reviewed the damning footage. No more being able to gaslight you or play the victim. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching Marcella time and again violating our trust, stealing, breaking things, then nonchalantly lying about it later. This was who she really was under that sweet facade. Finally, I knew it was time to force a confrontation with both her and Darius present. I invited them over for a family meeting, not giving away my true intentions. When they arrived, I could immediately sense Marcella's wariness. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously at Jonah's presence. "What's this all about?" I took a steadying breath. "You wanted proof that you don't belong in this house? Well, here it is." With trembling hands, I queued up the video compilation of her antics, stealing cash, inviting strangers over, the wanton destruction. Her eyes went wide with shock and outrage as it played. "You've been spying on me?" "What the hell, Alara?" "No more lies," I stated firmly. "It's time you both saw the truth about what kind of person you really are." Darius watched in pained silence, his expression unreadable. I could only hope this would finally be the wake-up call he needed to stop enabling her behavior. When it was over, Marcella laughed humorlessly. "Very clever, but it won't work. Darius knows I'd never betray him like that." I braced myself, praying he would finally take a stand. The weight of this moment pressed heavily. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcella stared Darius down, her expression a sickening mix of feigned innocence and subtle challenge. "You know I'd never betray you like that, right, bro?" For a few agonizing moments, Darius didn't respond. He simply watched the damning video evidence with an unreadable expression. I held my breath, clinging to the desperate hope that this would finally make him see his sister for the manipulative leech she truly was. Then, slowly, Darius turned to face Marcella. "How could you do this?" His voice was little more than a hoarse whisper. "To my own wife." Relief washed over me. He was taking my side at last. But Marcella simply scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, come on. Like you're so innocent in all this. You've been standing by letting your shrill harpy of a wife walk all over me from day one." "Don't you dare talk about her like that." Darius's shout made us all flinch. "Alara is twice the person you'll ever be." For the first time since I'd known her, Marcella looked momentarily shaken, but she quickly recovered with a contemptuous sneer. Yeah, go ahead and take her side as always, like either of you have a clue about real family loyalty." "This has nothing to do with loyalty," I exploded, unable to contain myself any longer. "You've been freeloading off us, stealing from us, disrespecting us in our own home." Marcella whirled on me, her eyes glittering with venom. "Disrespecting you? This coming from the woman who's been treating me like a burden from the second I stepped foot in this place? Because that's exactly what you are." The words burst forth, harsher than I intended, but too late to take back. "A selfish, entitled leech who thinks she can just take whatever she wants from us without giving anything in return." A tense silence fell over the room. Marcella opened her mouth, no doubt to spit out a scathing retort, but seemed to think better of it. Her gaze flicked briefly over to where Jonah stood silently observing, his phone gripped in his hand. A look of realization flickered across her face. With an overly dramatic huff, Marcella spun on her heel and stormed out, knocking over a vase on her way that shattered across the floor. Darius made no move to stop her, his shoulders sagging in apparent exhaustion. I'm so sorry, Alara," he murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. "You were right all along. I should have listened and put a stop to this sooner." I wanted to feel vindicated, but the wound of his betrayal still stung too sharply. Before I could form a response, Jonah cleared his throat, holding up his phone with a grim look. "Don't worry, I got her little tantrum on camera, too. Once this inevitably goes public, that'll be the final nail in her reputation's coffin." I could only nod numbly, because no matter how much satisfaction I might feel at having finally exposed Marcella's scheme, nothing could undo the painful truth. She had driven an irreparable wedge between Darius and me. True to Jonah's prediction, within a matter of days, the video exposing Marcella's misdeeds had gone viral online. I wasn't sure if he had leaked it himself, or if one of Marcella's so-called friends had spread it in an act of petty revenge, but the result was the same. Her deplorable behavior was on full display for the whole world to see. I'll admit, there was a perverse sense of satisfaction watching the clip of her unhinged meltdown rack up millions of views, along with a tsunami of scathing comments calling her out as the entitled parasite she was. "The mask finally slipped, huh?" Jonah remarked as we scrolled through the deluge of reactions. "People are seeing her for the real piece of work she is." My satisfaction was short-lived, however, as the backlash steadily intensified over the following days. Protesters began gathering outside our home, denouncing Marcella in the harshest of terms and demanding she face consequences. "This is getting out of hand," Darius said nervously as the raucous crowds showed no sign of letting up. I could only shrug, numb to it all. She brought this on herself. That's when Marcella finally resurfaced, storming back into the house in a whirlwind of fury. "You happy now?" she raged, tears of rage streaking her blotchy face. "You just had to try and humiliate me to the world, didn't you? Like you didn't bring that on yourself?" I shot back, unmoved. "You're the one hell-bent on burning every bridge with your selfish, unforgivable behavior." "Unforgivable?" She let out a bark of deranged laughter. "You want to see unforgivable?" Before I could react, Marcella grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and flung it straight at me with startling force. I barely had time to flinch before the solid mass struck my temple, unleashing a searing wave of blinding pain and darkness. The next thing I remember was gradually regaining consciousness to see Darius restraining a still hysterical Marcella while Jonah hovered over me, calling an ambulance. Blood trickled warmly down my face from the ragged gash in my head. "Why?" I croaked out in a daze. "Why would you do this?" For a moment, a flicker of anguished regret passed over Marcella's face, but it was quickly snuffed out, her eyes hardening into cold callousness once more. "Because I warned you there would be consequences for trying to take everything away from me," she spat out in a tone of chilling finality. "And this is just the beginning if you don't back off." The ominous vow hung heavy in the air, even as the wail of approaching sirens signaled this sickening conflict was about to be thrust into an even harsher spotlight. As I slipped back into the blissful darkness, one fact became terribly clear. No home was safe with Marcella in it, not for me, or anyone else she deemed an obstacle to be eliminated by any means necessary. In the aftermath of Marcella's violent attack, everything changed. The trust and foundations of our marriage had been shattered beyond repair by her unforgivable actions. As I recovered from my injuries, Darius and I knew we could no longer go on living under the same roof as his unhinged sister, not after the terror and threats she unleashed. We filed a restraining order immediately, but the metaphorical scars cut far deeper. "I'm so sorry, Alara," Darius said for what felt like the 1,000th time. Regret and shame were etched into the worry lines on his face. I never imagined she could become so monstrous. I said nothing, unable to offer absolution just yet. My mind still replayed those harrowing moments on an endless loop. Marcella's twisted snarl as she hurled that vase, the sickening impact, her vile parting words. Some betrayals cut too deep to simply forgive. The financial and legal fallout was another nightmare altogether. Changing all the deeds, accounts, and updating our wills to permanently excise Marcella. It was a lengthy, draining process designed to fortify every possible vulnerability she could try to exploit. We didn't stop there either. Thanks to Jonah's quick thinking in capturing that fateful confrontation, Marcella's criminal assault was a matter of public record. We leveraged that into investing in state-of-the-art home security. Cameras, alarm systems, the full works. If she ever thought about coming near us again, we'd be ready. By the time we got the all clear to return home, it was as if a miasma had been lifted. No longer did we have to tiptoe around Marcella's dizzying sense of entitlement. The house was ours again, a sanctuary finally rid of her toxic presence. As a symbol of our reclamation, we held a massive yard sale and unceremoniously sold off every last belonging Marcella had brazenly dragged into our home during her occupation. Darius and I watched with grim satisfaction as her clothes, knickknacks, and cheap furnishings were picked over and hauled away by strangers. I'll never forget the palpable relief I felt as that final decrepit recliner, the last remaining trace of her squatting, was hoisted onto the truck of some lucky bargain hunter. "We made it through the worst of it," Darius murmured, slipping his hand into mine. His grip was warm, reassuring. "Our home is ours again." I gave his fingers a grateful squeeze, finally allowing myself to release the resentment and anger that had festered for so long. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, one thing was certain: that poisonous influence was exorcised from our lives for good. As the moving truck rumbled away with Marcella's sad collection of rejects, I inhaled the crisp spring air deeply. It carried the refreshing scent of new beginnings, of reclaimed happiness just waiting to blossom again. Our home was a sanctuary once more, and this time nothing and no one would ever be allowed to violate that sanctity again. The sound of my purse unzipping made me jolt upright on the living room couch. My heart raced as I spotted Kyle, my new stepson, rifling through it greedily. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, anger surging through me. Kyle froze, clutching a wad of bills in his hand. "I was just borrowing some cash," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I marched over and snatched my purse back. "You can't just steal from me. That money was for groceries." He glared at me defiantly. "Since when do I need permission to take what's mine? My dad makes enough to cover the little you spend." The sheer audacity of his words left me stunned. How did this entitled brat think he could justify thievery under my own roof? Alan rushed in from the kitchen, alerted by the commotion. "What's going on?" "Your son here helped himself to cash from my purse. Again," I said through gritted teeth. Alan's expression hardened as he turned to Kyle. "Son, you know you can't just take things without asking, especially from Marlene." "Why not?" Kyle scoffed. "You're the one who married this broke widow and brought her into our family." The venom in his words struck like vicious blows. I recoiled, feeling like an unwanted outsider being ungratefully tolerated in their home. Alan stepped towards Kyle, his fists clenched. "That's enough. You'll treat Marlene with respect. She's your stepmother now, and this is her house too." "Oh yeah? Well, maybe if you hadn't wasted your money on this loser." In a flash, Alan grabbed Kyle by the collar and shoved him against the wall. I gasped, my heart pounding frantically. "Don't you ever speak about her like that again," Alan growled, his face contorted with rage I'd never seen before. "Get out of my sight before I really lose it." Kyle shrugged off Alan's grip, straightening his shirt as he headed for the door. "Whatever, old man. You're both pathetic." The front door slammed, leaving Alan and I alone in a tense silence. He buried his face in his hands, sighing heavily. I'm so sorry you had to see that, Marlene." His voice quivered with a mix of anger and dismay. "No, I'm the one who's sorry," I said, fighting back tears. "If I'd known your son was going to cause so much drama, I never would have." "Don't say that." Alan gently took my hands in his. "Kyle's issues aren't your fault. I'll deal with him." I stared back at my new husband, my heart aching with doubts and insecurities. This wasn't the fresh start I'd envisioned when I agreed to marry Alan and move into his home. Kyle's resentment towards me had manifested more venomously than I could have imagined. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of my life. A darkness loomed on the horizon, and the relative peace I'd found after my first husband's passing was about to be shattered. Later that night, Alan and I sat in tense silence at the dinner table, both of us too shaken to have much appetite. The earlier blow-up with Kyle had cast a dark cloud over our newly merged household. "I need to explain some things about Kyle," Alan finally said, pushing his half-eaten plate away. "Things I probably should have told you before we got married." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, bracing myself for whatever troubles lay beneath the surface of his son's repulsive behavior. Alan took a deep breath. "Kyle's mother and we had a really nasty divorce when he was 14. Lots of screaming matches and ugly custody battles. She managed to turn him against me for years with her vicious lies." He shook his head slowly. "Then she hooked up with this real scumbag boyfriend who introduced Kyle to drugs, petty crime, you name it. By the time I got him back, he was already deep into that world, stealing, selling drugs, running with a bad crew." My eyes widened in disbelief. My God, I had no idea it was that bad. He's been in real legal trouble? More than once, Alan said grimly. Theft, possession charges, you name it. He's pulled himself out of some deep holes but keeps finding his way back into them. I stared at him, aghast. If he's really that messed up, how could you allow him to just move in here after we married? He's putting us both at risk. Because he's my son. Alan snapped, defensiveness flaring in his eyes. Despite all his screw-ups, I can't just abandon him. He's got nobody else in this world. I wanted to argue, to insist that Kyle's very presence was a clear threat to the peaceful life I craved, the life I thought I was signing up for by marrying Alan. But I could see the anguish and guilt weighing heavily on my new husband's shoulders. I'm sorry, I said, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. I know you're in an impossible situation as his dad. We'll get through this together, okay? Alan squeezed my hand tightly and managed a pained smile. You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that. Most other women would have run for the hills by now. I tried to make light of the situation. Well, I'm too stubborn and strong-willed to let a little thing like your criminal son scare me off. We both managed a gentle laugh, momentarily breaking the tension. But as Alan headed to take a shower, leaving me alone at the table, a cold realization crept over me. The casual theft from my purse had been just the tip of the iceberg. By welcoming Kyle into our home, we'd opened the door to a world of darkness, illegal activities, violence, and God knows what other dangers. I remembered the cocky smirk on his face as he insulted me mere hours ago. There was something chillingly sinister lurking behind those eyes, far beyond the brashness of typical teenage rebellion. A shudder ran down my spine. Had I grossly underestimated the depravity of this boy? No, this man whose twisted path in life could easily bring ruin to the new dream I was trying to build? I knew in that moment that dark days lay ahead. Kyle's very presence had instantly transformed my new marriage from a longed-for sanctuary into a minefield of constantly looking over my shoulder. And as I absorbed the full scope of the situation Alan had gradually let slip, one thing became crystallized in my mind. That vile, manipulative snake was not going to take away my hard-won chance at happiness without a brutal fight. In the weeks that followed, Kyle's audacious demands and destructive behavior only escalated. It was as if he viewed our home as his personal playground, thinking he could treat Alan and I as his servants. I need some extra cash, he declared one morning, barging into the kitchen while I prepared breakfast. My car payment's due. I shot him an incredulous look over my shoulder. Your car payment? Maybe you should get a job and cover your own expenses for once. Kyle sneered. Why should I work when my dad has so much money? Just give me what I need. That's enough, Alan interjected sternly, entering from the living room. I'm not just handing you piles of cash whenever you want it. You're a grown man. Act like it and get a job. In a blur of movement, Kyle swept his arm across the kitchen counter, sending plates, glasses, and silverware clattering to the floor in an explosion of shattered ceramic and glass. You ungrateful old bastard, he screamed, his face contorted into an animalistic rage. After all the hell I went through because of you. Alan stood motionless, seemingly petrified by his son's outburst. I jumped back, gasping as shards crunched under my feet. Get out, I growled through gritted teeth, mustering all my courage. Get out of our house right now, before I call the police. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. With one last menacing glare at us both, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hallway, slamming the front door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Once his footsteps faded, I crumpled into a chair, struggling to fight back terrified sobs. Alan immediately moved to comfort me, wrapping his arms tightly around my shaking shoulders. His own eyes were glazed with moisture. I'm so sorry, Marlene, he whispered hoarsely. You never should have had to go through that. You need to make him leave, I said, forcing the words out between shuddering breaths. He's out of control. He's going to seriously hurt one of us. Alan drew back, cupping my face in his calloused hands. I know, baby. After that explosion, I finally see he's too far gone. Thank God, I thought with a surge of relief. Finally, he was seeing sense. Or so I believed, until Kyle sauntered back through the front door 2 hours later, looking utterly unfazed by his meltdown. And he wasn't alone. Trailing closely behind him was a flashy woman in her late 20s with heavy eye makeup and tight, revealing clothes. Her disinterested scowl seemed permanently affixed on her face. Kyle flung his arm around her shoulders, grinning smugly at us. "Since you two don't seem to like me being around so much, I'll just have Diane here move in to keep me company." The blood drained from my face as Alan and I exchanged a look of disbelieving horror. Move his skanky girlfriend? No, this couldn't be happening. Kyle? Absolutely not, Alan warned, anger seeping back into his voice. Don't you dare bring that kind of riffraff into our home. Too bad, old man. It's happening, Kyle taunted. With that, he brushed past us both, pulling Diane down the hallway to what was originally Alan's study. "Oh yeah, you guys can move your little homework space to the garage," he called over his shoulder flippantly. "Me and Babe need our own bedroom." I slumped back into the chair, burying my face in my hands as the sounds of raucous laughter and thumping bass erupted from down the hallway. This nightmare was only getting worse, and my husband seemed powerless to rein in his monster of a son. Living under the same roof as Kyle and his disrespectful girlfriend Diane was a waking nightmare. Nights were filled with thumping bass from their room, shouting matches, and God knows what other disturbances. Worst of all were the little glimpses I'd catch of disturbing activities whenever I passed by their door, furtive figures coming and going at all hours, hushed conversations abruptly silenced by glares in my direction. It was becoming increasingly clear that more than just his obnoxious presence was pervading our home. Kyle was running some sort of illicit operation right under our roof, putting Alan and I at legal risk. One sweltering summer night, the hallway reeked of marijuana smoke yet again. I stormed down to their door and pounded my fist against it furiously. "Kyle, keep that crap away from our part of the house. I'm not letting you turn this into some kind of trap den." The door flew open, and Kyle's sneering face appeared in the cloud of smoke. "Back off, you dried-up old hag," he spat. "What I do in my room is none of your business." My jaw clenched with rage. It becomes my business when it's happening in my home and putting me in legal jeopardy. From over Kyle's shoulder, I spotted Diane lounging on the bed in a skimpy top, lazily scrolling on her phone as if nothing were amiss. "You want a nice, quiet home? Maybe you should have stayed a lonely widow then, instead of marrying into my family's problems." Kyle snarled. With a sudden shove, he sent me stumbling back. I lost my balance and crumpled hard onto the hallway floor, crying out in shock and pain as my elbow smacked against the wall. "That's it! You're out of here!" I heard Alan roar as he rushed in from the living room. "Don't you ever lay a hand on my wife again." He reached down to help me up, his face contorted in fury. For once, there were no hallowed pleas to his son, only unbridled rage. Kyle responded by spitting a huge gob of phlegm that landed squarely on Alan's cheek. The twisted smile on his face was one of pure malice. "Get out," Alan growled in a low, gravelly voice I'd never heard before. "Get out of my house before I bash your skull in and happily let the law deal with me after." Kyle cackled, seeming almost delighted at having provoked this normally mild-mannered man to the brink of violence. "Oh, I'll get out, old man. Just try and make me leave empty-handed after supporting my worthless life for—" Before he could finish, Alan's fist connected squarely with Kyle's nose in an explosion of blood and cartilage. Kyle crumpled to the floor with a high-pitched howl of agony. "That's for Marlene, you piece of garbage!" Alan spat down at his son, flexing his knuckles. The bravado disappeared from Kyle's demeanor as he cowered on the floor, cradling his gushing nose. "You'll pay for this," he blubbered through a torrent of blood and tears. "I'll make you miserable." Summoning whatever was left of my nerve, I forced myself to my feet and leveled an accusatory finger at Diane, who continued to sit casually watching the violence unfold. "Get this trash out of my house," I hissed. "Both of you, before we call the police and public services to forcibly remove you." For once the skanky woman's face betrayed a flicker of alarm, comprehending the very real prospect of legal consequences beyond this domestic dispute. In a flurry of motion, she gathered her and Kyle's belongings into ratty duffel bags as Alan and I watched stoically. With one last venomous look over his shoulder, Kyle allowed himself to be pulled out the front door, slouching away into the night, still cradling his battered face. Only when the rumble of their beat-up Honda had faded did we collapse into each other's arms, physically and emotionally spent from the turmoil. "I'm so sorry, Marlene," Alan rasped softly into my hair. "You didn't deserve any of this." Gently pulling back, I cupped his face in my hands and forced his gaze to meet mine. "No more apologies," I stated firmly. "That monster is out of our lives for good, and he's not taking anything else from us." Deep down, however, I knew it was too dangerous to rest on that conviction. The menacing fury in Kyle's eyes as he was ejected betrayed something far more unsettling than the tantrum of a spoiled brat. My stepson was unraveling into a vicious, vindictive menace willing to go to extremes in pursuit of revenge. And whatever dark dealings he'd been involved in, his pride and greed would never allow him to walk away without extracting a price. Alan and I had only begun to pay, but even we couldn't fathom how steep the cost would become. In the days after Kyle's explosive eviction, an eerie calm descended over our home. Alan and I walked on eggshells, constantly bracing for some form of retaliation that never came. "He has to be plotting something," I muttered to Alan one evening as we picked at our dinner in tense silence. "Kyle's not the type to just slink away." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're probably right. I have no idea what he's capable of at this point." We both jumped as my phone began ringing, the shrill tone shattering the quiet. I felt my pulse quicken as I saw the caller ID. It was my brother Eric. "Hello?" "Marlene, it's me." His familiar voice crackled over the line. I think we need to talk, in person." There was an uncharacteristic solemnity to his tone that instantly put me on edge. Eric wasn't one to mince words or ask to meet up unless something serious was going on. "What's this about?" I asked, unable to mask the tremor of worry in my voice. A pause. "It's about your stepson, Kyle. I've been looking into a few things. We should discuss it face to face." My eyes flicked over to meet Alan's concerned gaze. This couldn't be good. "Okay, come over tonight after you get off work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I spent the next few hours in a state of nervous agitation, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios about what Eric might have uncovered. Was Kyle pushing drugs, involved in organized crime of some kind? The possibilities were chilling. When Eric finally arrived that evening, his face was taut and grim. He made a beeline for the couch and dropped his voice to a hushed murmur, glancing furtively around as if he feared we were being watched. "I've been piecing some things together through my contacts and databases at the precinct," he began in a low growl. "That kid of yours, Alan, he's mixed up in some seriously dangerous stuff." Eric ran a hand over his thinning hair. "Stolen identities, credit fraud, you name it. He's got an entire black market operation going, using those scumbag friends of his to siphon money and rip people off blind." I felt the blood drain from my face as realization dawned. The shadowy figures coming and going at all hours, the scrapped plans for Alan's study to become their lair, it all made sense now. "That's why he was so desperate to keep you from kicking him out," Eric continued grimly. "He needed to operate out of your home undetected. Guys like that, they'll do anything to keep their schemes going." Alan's face was ashen. Oh God, when I think of all the times he brought strange people around, started getting belligerent out of nowhere, he was protecting his crooked schemes all along. My brother leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as his eyes bored into ours with steely intensity. "Which is why the two of you are in very real danger. Kyle clearly has no limits to what he'll do, and guys involved in this level of fraud tend to have extremely dangerous connections." The unspoken suggestion hung in the heavy silence that getting on the wrong side of Kyle's operations could mean deadly consequences. "We need to handle this extremely carefully," Eric said, his expression grave. "One misstep and you could find yourself swept up into a world you don't want any part of." My heart pounded in my ears as the gravity of the situation became clear. That vicious, greedy snake of a stepson had turned our home into a den of criminality. And now he wouldn't stop until he'd exacted vengeance upon us for daring to defy him. I felt Alan's hand finding mine, gripping tightly as we digested this nightmare in silence. Our very lives could be at stake at the hands of his own unhinged son. With a resolute nod to my brother, I knew there was only one path forward, no matter how dangerous. We had to stop Kyle's malevolence, once and for all. and we would have to match his ruthlessness every step of the way to survive. Over the next few days, Eric worked feverishly behind the scenes to gather intelligence on Kyle's operation. Calls were made, surveillance footage poured over, shady contacts leveraged for any crumbs of information. Finally, he presented us with the bombshell. Kyle's crew was about to pull off a massive identity theft and fraud scheme, their biggest score yet, and he had the date, time, and location. This is our chance to nail that piece of garbage once and for all. Eric growled, slapping a thick manila folder on our kitchen table. I'll organize a sting with my unit to catch him red-handed. Alan and I exchanged anxious glances. Taking down Kyle's criminal empire was the obvious necessity, but the prospect of being intimately involved in such a high-stakes police operation filled us with trepidation. "What do you need us to do?" Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric fixed us with an intense stare. "We're going to use Kyle's greed against him. I'll have one of my undercovers reach out saying they have some high-value financial data to sell." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "And the two of you are going to be the brokers who set up the meeting, the ones who can get him to show up in person so we can grab his slimy ass." A tense silence stretched between us as Alan and I processed what he was asking. Not only would we be dangling criminal bait in front of that viper, we'd be serving ourselves up as targets to draw his fangs. But what other choice was there? We were already marked by his venom. Leaving him to run rampant would only ensure he circled back around to strike again when we least expected it. "Whatever it takes," I said firmly, squaring my shoulders as I met my brother's gaze. "If being part of the sting is what's needed to finally rid our lives of that cancer once and for all, I'll do it." Alan gave a grim nod of agreement, lacing his fingers tightly through mine. 2 nights later, we found ourselves seated at a seedy bar near the industrial district, my stomach tying itself in knots as we awaited our undercover's call signaling that the trap was set. The burner phone finally rang, and I felt my heart lurch into my throat. "It's go time!" Alan muttered, eyes flicking around the dingy establishment as I answered the call with trembling hands. "Yeah, I got a hot new bank data dump to move," the gruff voice at the other end stated matter-of-factly. "You still looking to buy?" "Of course," I replied, struggling to keep my tone even and businesslike despite my inner turmoil. "My partner and I can meet with the merchandise in hand tonight, ready to make a deal if it passes muster." "Perfect. Warehouse District, 10 p.m. Listen for my message on the burn phone with the exact location in 30 minutes. The call clicked off abruptly, leaving Alan and I to await further instructions with bated breath. True to their word, a new text arrived giving us a specific address, a derelict factory on the fringes of the warehouse district. Isolated, cavernous, the ideal setting for criminal dealings to unfold undetected, or so they would believe. As we pulled up outside the rusting gates, my brother's message crackled urgently through the phone's tinny speaker. "Got you covered from all angles. Just play it cool and stay frosty. Units are in position, eyes on your target coming in from the east side." My chest tightened as the unmistakable growl of Kyle's beat-up Honda echoed off the buildings, pulling in through the far gates with its high beams blazing. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the door slammed open, his hulking form emerging into the sickly glow of the street lamps. "Well, well," he sneered as he swaggered forward, flanked by 2 of his slimy henchmen. "If it isn't Dad and the little wifey." Despite the terror coursing through me, a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination washed over me in that moment. This soulless predator had tormented our family for the last time. With a subtle nod, I signaled that the game was truly afoot. Let the vipers ensnare themselves for one final act of retribution. Kyle swaggered forward, that same twisted smirk frozen on his face, the same one that had mocked me so many times during his reign of terror under our roof. "So what's this big score you mugs are trying to peddle?" he sneered, looking us up and down with contempt. "It better be good, or else this little reunion is gonna get ugly." I felt Alan tense beside me, but kept my own expression steely. "We'll let you inspect the merchandise first, if the price is right." Producing a weathered USB drive, I placed it squarely in Kyle's outstretched palm with a subtle nod to Eric's team lying in wait. The Viper's eyes lit up with greedy intrigue, his focus fully fixated on the promise of an illicit payday. With a grunt, he handed it off to one of his henchmen, who immediately got to work on a laptop, no doubt scrutinizing the data for any whiff of fraud potential. While they were distracted, my gaze landed on the other crony loitering nearby, idly scrolling through his phone, until I noticed the unmistakable glint of a knife peeking out from his waistband. My heart stuttered with a new surge of panic. These weren't just amateur crooks. They were strapped and ready for any potential violence. One wrong move, and this entire sting could devolve into a deadly crossfire with me and Alan caught squarely in the middle. I reached out and gave Alan's hand a subtle squeeze, hoping my brother's unit was as dialed in as they promised to be. "Looks legit," the henchman finally grunted after several tense moments, slapping the laptop closed. "Ez money, as long as your crazy-ass family ain't trying to set us up." A sly smile crept across Kyle's lips as he leveled his gaze at us. "Now why would we want to do that? After all the fond memories?" His fingers closed tightly around the USB drive, the smirk morphing into a full sneer. "Maybe we'll take this little payoff and a little extra fee from dear old Dad to make up for all the grief your bitch put me through." My jaw clenched, fury blazing inside me. Of course, he couldn't let this go without one final sadistic jab. Too much to ask for a simple ending where the snake gets what's coming to him. "You must be stupider than you look," I spat back, fists clenching at my sides. "We're not going to just hand you money, you parasite." In a flash, both henchmen produced their weapons, leveling them squarely at us. I gasped, instinctively grabbing Alan and pushing him behind me as they fanned out in a menacing semicircle. "Maybe you didn't get the memo," the knife-wielding thug snarled. "We ain't asking for money. We're taking it. Drop 'em. You're surrounded." The barked command seemed to reverberate from all directions as the night exploded in a blinding haze of flashbang grenades. I blinked and coughed, struggling to see through the smoke and spot the source of the chaos. Suddenly, what seemed like dozens of black-clad figures materialized through the haze, weapons trained in a tight semicircle around Kyle and his stunned goons. "This is the police!" Eric's commanding voice boomed over a bullhorn. "Get on the ground with your hands up!" There was a tense beat of stunned silence until the knife wielder made the mistake of whipping his blade in a wild, yet unpredictable arc, met instantly with a searing volley of beanbag rounds from the officers slamming into his chest and abdomen. As he collapsed, wheezing, there was one final snap of resistance as Kyle made a panicked break for his car. But my brother was prepared, rushing out of the smoke to put him in a wrenching arm lock that sent him crashing to the pavement. "Kyle Turner, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and a whole host of other fun charges." Eric growled through gritted teeth as the cuffs clicked into place. "Anything you say or do will only make your life that much harder, scumbag." The still defiant scowl instantly drained from Kyle's face, replaced with naked terror as he finally grasped that the tables had turned and the ultimate consequences were closing in. As the officers hauled him roughly to his feet, his wild eyes met mine briefly, and I was flooded with the most intoxicating sensation of vindictive satisfaction. This sadistic tormentor who'd inflicted so much misery was finally, irreversibly, getting the brutal payback he deserved at the hands of righteous karma, and I was going to revel in every second of his downfall. The weeks following Kyle's dramatic arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, lurid media frenzies, and the gradual unraveling of the tangled web he'd woven. It seemed every time we thought we'd grasped the full extent of his criminal enterprises, more sordid layers would emerge. I watched it all unfold from the gallery with a strange sense of detached amusement. The smarmy swagger, the sadistic manipulation, the sheer delusion of entitlement, all of it had finally caught up to ensnare my stepson in its unforgiving karmic trap. His wretched girlfriend Diane was wrapped up in the dragnet as well, already flipped by the prosecution and ratting out every last depraved detail in a desperate bid for leniency. At this point, she was nothing more than a bug on the windshield to me, easily swatted away and forgotten amid the larger impact headed Kyle's way. Eric was relentless, leaving no insidious crevice of their activities unturned or unpunished. Fraud, money laundering, drug trafficking. Kyle's reckoning was swift and absolute. With the mountain of evidence stacked against him, it wasn't a question of if he'd be convicted, but just how many years he'd be burying himself alive behind bars. The jury has reached a verdict. Those 4 simple words from the judge's mouth sent an electric surge of anticipation through the courtroom gallery. Kyle stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as his team of lawyers frantically conferred one last time. The foreperson rose and cleared his throat solemnly. On the charges of mail fraud, aggravated identity theft, and drug conspiracy, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle Turner, guilty on all counts. A muted shockwave seemed to ripple through the room, punctuated only by Kyle's lawyer slumping back in her chair, utterly deflated. His lips contorted into a silent snarl, though whether out of anger or resignation, I couldn't tell. As the remainder of the lengthy verdict was read aloud, something inside me began to uncurl and unfurl. A profound lightness I hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. The tightness that had gripped my heart for so long steadily dissipated with every guilty issued upon my tormentor. We shuffled out through the courthouse steps into a swarm of cameras and microphones from the awaiting press, my brother taking the lead to address the media frenzy. This case sends a clear and resounding message to those who seek to corrupt and victimize our communities, he boomed in that signature authoritative rasp. We will pursue them to the fullest extent of the law and bring the full hammer of justice upon their heads. As flash bulbs exploded all around us, I sought out Alan's eyes amidst the chaos. He gave me the faintest of smiles and a subtle nod. The ghost of the same weary, downtrodden man who'd been paralyzed by his son's long trail of transgressions had finally been exorcised. He too seemed to feel the lightening of our collective burden. That night, after the cameras and crowds had dispersed, we sat in peaceful silence on the back patio. Cicadas droned their evening chorus under a canopy of stars twinkling brilliantly in the warm summer darkness. So much had changed, yet felt startlingly unchanged at the same time. The house was precisely as we'd left it that fateful morning, and yet the oppressive storm cloud that had followed us home from the courthouse finally felt completely lifted. You know, I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around how far that sick bastard was willing to go, Alan said at last, cradling his beer bottle pensively. Just to what? Punish us for not enabling him anymore? I gave a slow shake of my head. At the end of the day, it was never really about us, just his own greed and depravity swallowing him whole. I thought back to that cold, chilling glare Kyle had leveled at me in the courtroom while receiving his sentence, not one of rage or hatred, but a fathomless emptiness. For all his blustering malice, he was now just an empty husk being justly carted away. He'll spend every day of the prime of his life rotting behind bars, I stated with grim finality, and all he'll have is that void where his soul should have been to keep him company. Alan nodded, the ghost of a smirk toying at the corner of his lips as the cocoon of our nightmare finally shed away completely. So I guess that means we get to focus on filling our lives with better things now. You know, like a little peace and happiness for once. The enormity of that simple idea hung in the air, more revitalizing than the gentle breeze kicking up around us. Pulling me close, Alan pressed his lips to the top of my head, a kiss filled with a renewed sense of purpose and the untold promise of whatever lay ahead. For the first time in what felt like eternities, the horizon was wide open and full of possibilities. I'd say we've earned every last drop of it, babe, he murmured warmly against my hair, and I can't wait to start living it.